Unite beyond boundaries. Innovate together. Joe's PANKRATION 2024. No border.
Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Excited to be here today and to share the stage with 70 speakers from across the world. I want to start with a bit of a confession. I often come up with what I think are great app ideas. What I usually do then is to go off and buy a domain name for that app idea. What happens way too often is that I then never end up launching that app for many different reasons. So let's just say that my list of bought but unused domain names is very long. My name is Gunnar Grosch. I am a developer advocate at AWS based in Sweden. Before joining AWS about 4 years ago, I was an AWS user group leader and an AWS serverless hero. And in this session, I want to talk to you about how to go from just having ideas, like I have lots of, to actually start building applications. So I have no doubt that you in the audience, you probably also have lots of great application ideas. Lots of new ideas for new features, things you want to build maybe for work, or things you want to build for yourself personally. But then how do you go from having an idea to actually putting them into production? How do you make your app ideas into reality? Well, we have an answer for that. And the answer is short and sweet. It's serverless and event-driven architectures, because that lets you turn your application ideas into actual applications a lot faster. So the growth of serverless, it is because it is helping you make your job easier. With the serverless way of thinking, you can delegate a lot of the fundamentals to AWS, so you instead can then automatically scale up and down with demand for your app. You can make use of built-in reliability and security, and you can reduce the cost of your app with pay-as-you-go usage. And running it, it is a lot easier. But the thing is, we also want to make sure that it is easy to actually build the application and get it out to production. So I want to jump over to my application idea. And the thing is, I have lots of documents. I have documents and documents and documents. Lots of them where I store notes, I store information, and so on. And I don't really know exactly what all of those documents are. So what I want to build is an application that summarizes my documents and stores them somewhere. So I am the user. I had, like I said, lots of documents. I then want to use a machine learning model using generative AI to then summarize those documents and store the information in some sort of database, a data store. So then with that application, we can then turn this into a serverless application on AWS. So let's look at what that would look like. So it's still going to be me being the user, and then I'm going to make use of Amazon S3 as an object store. So I upload my documents to S3, and for each document that gets uploaded, we will then invoke an AWS Lambda function, and that Lambda function will then make use of Amazon Bedrock to summarize the documents for me, and then store all of that information in Amazon DynamoDB as our database or data store. So this is basically my application, my MVP architecture. So how would we go about building and developing this type of application then? Well, there are different ways of doing it. And to be honest, when you want to get started, just jumping into the console and get used to a service, no matter if it's AWS Lambda or if it's any other service, I think that's good. It's good to get to know a service that way. But as soon as you want to start actually putting things into production, well, you should start thinking about using something else. And you want to use infrastructure as code. And there are lots of different ways of doing that. You can use AWS SAM, the serverless application model. You can use cloud or the cloud development kit, CDK, or third-party options like serverless framework or Terraform. And they are all different ways of just using code to define your application. And some people love YAML. I'm not one of them. I don't really love seeing what you see on screen right now. So there are easier ways of doing this, and that's what we're going to look at now. A while back, we launched something called AWS Application Composer, which is a visual designer that makes it easier to both visualize and design your applications. So let's jump into it and start actually building the application. And this was the architecture we had, and I'm going to start off by building part of it in this case. And we're going to build that top part, basically have the S3 bucket, a Lambda function that gets invoked, and then a DynamoDB table to store things in. So let's basically jump into it. So this is our familiar AWS console, and we're now going to open up AWS Application Composer in the console. So when we open Application Composer, this is what we're greeted with. And the first thing we want to do then is to create a new project for us. And something that's a bit different with Application Composer is that you're using it locally. So this is something that you are running in the cloud in this case, but you're going to store files locally. So the next thing we need to do is to activate so that we're actually storing things locally. So we're activating something called local sync. And we select a folder where we want to store our files. I'm going to create a new folder in this case. And then when I've created that folder, I can select it. Then I need to confirm that we should be able to view things in the folder, and then that we want to be able to store things in the folder. And as soon as that is done, we can start building our application. And what we see here is the local folder that I've created. And you can see straight away that we have a template.yaml file. This is where things are stored in our application. So let's start building our application. And the first part of it, well, that was that S3 bucket. So we're starting out with the S3 component, dragging that onto the canvas, and then we give it a name, a logical ID. Document summary bucket in this case. There are other options, but we're going to stick with the defaults. And as you can see, now Application Composer has generated that YAML for me, so I don't have to write that YAML that I don't really like. Now, with the S3 bucket in place, we can add the next component, which is our Lambda function. So we add the Lambda function, once again, open up the details, give it a logical ID. We can then set the path where we want to store the code for the function. We can choose the package type. We can choose our runtime from all different runtimes available. I'm sticking with Node.js. We can select the architecture, the amount of memory for our function, the timeout values, permissions, and a lot of other settings. We're sticking with defaults in this case. Next thing, when we have that added, you can see it's also visible now in the template. Once again, YAML I didn't have to write. Now let's connect these two together. So we drag in between the bucket and the Lambda function. And what that means is that it's going to add a trigger, meaning that when something is created in the bucket, it will trigger my Lambda function. And then we add the last component, which is our DynamoDB table. Drag it onto the canvas in the same way, open up the details, give it a logical name, document summary table. We can change settings. Once again, I'm sticking with the default values. Saving that. And with that in place, we can then connect the Lambda function to the table. And that gives the Lambda function an environment variable and also a policy to be able to actually store things in the table. So now we have our architecture created on the canvas. So let's move on. I'm switching over to my IDE. My IDE in this case is VS Code. And with VS Code, we can then open up that same folder. So we open up the folder. And as you can see, we then have our template with rows and rows of YAML. We have our Lambda function code. And as you can see, since I have the AWS toolkit installed, I actually have Application Composer available in the IDE as well, meaning that I can do everything I did in the console straight away in the IDE. All right, so let's create some code. I'm opening up the Lambda function. As you can see, it's just boilerplate code to begin with. I'll remove that. And now I'm going to use Amazon Q Developer to generate code. So I'm just adding a comment. I want a Lambda function that is triggered by object upload to S3. The function will download the object from the S3 bucket, store the output in DynamoDB table with a unique ID, with the current date and time, the object key, and the object bucket. So now Q Developer will generate code for me based on that prompt. If it looks good, like it does in this case, I can just tab, and there I have my Lambda function. And it is using the SDK to connect to S3. It's using the event from the S3 bucket that triggered the Lambda function to get the bucket name and key, to open the object in S3. And then we're generating an ID, the timestamp with the date, the key, and the bucket name, and finally all of the data, the contents of the file. What Q Developer didn't do this time was to set the correct table name, because I actually didn't prompt it to. So it's just make up a table name in this case. But if you remember, our application composer actually created an environment variable for us. So I can just use that in this case, add it to the code, process environment, and add the environment variable. And then we have the item ready to store in DynamoDB. So let's save this Lambda function. And now we can open up our terminal window and deploy this into production. So we're running SAM deploy, and we're doing a guided one for the first time. So I'm just going to run through the wizard quickly, set a name, and then use the default values. And we're deploying that. And while that is deploying, I'm just going to show you an example of those documents that I want to use. And these are, in this case, simply text documents containing a lot of information about different AWS services. That's what I keep in my notes, apparently. So the application is deployed. So now we have our components deployed into the cloud. So they are available for use. So let's switch over to the console again. And with the console, I'm going to open up S3 and simply try this out. And in S3, I'm opening the correct bucket. And now I can take one of those documents, upload it into S3, which will trigger my Lambda function, which will run the code that Q Developer generated for me, which will store the information in DynamoDB. So if we go to DynamoDB, we can see that we have one item created. And the item is like we wanted it to. It has an ID, it's storing the bucket and the key, it sets a date, and it contains all of the data from that document that we uploaded. So mission successful. We were able to create our first application in just a few minutes using Application Composer and Amazon Q Developer to generate the actual code for us. So this is the architecture that we have right now. But then, as you remember, next step would be to add Bedrock. So then we would simply switch back, make use of Q Developer to add that part of the code as well, so we could actually create a summary of the document. And then we wouldn't stop there. Like with most apps, we would continue. So next step would be to create an API. Once again, we can make use of our tools and create that either through Application Composer or with the help of Amazon Q Developer. And next step maybe is that we add a static web page as a way of actually accessing this and an easier way to upload documents, and so on and so on. So we will keep adding new features into our application this way. So a few simple tips to round this up when you want to start building your first serverless application. Use a visual designer and infrastructure as code framework to do this. With Application Composer, it becomes a lot easier to see what you're doing and also show it to others. Make use of a generative AI-powered assistant, such as Q Developer, and test in the cloud. Just deploy, test it, deploy again, and test it. And start simple and evolve your app over time. Add new features over time. And eventually, start moving into using automation for deployment pipeline as well. And with that, in less than 15 minutes, we've deployed my app ID into the cloud. And I've shown you how you can visualize and design your applications using AWS Application Composer. Thank you very much. My name is Gunnar Grosch, developer advocate at AWS. and feel free to connect on social media.